Hi, everybody. It is week 6 already, which means we're about a third of the way through, actually a little better than a third of the way through the semester. So we're making good progress. Um, so this week, the lecture you can see is called Assembling Evidence Part 1. That means that Part 2 is next week. And we have a couple different emphases. This week, I want to lay the groundwork on this idea of assembling evidence and talk about some sources of evidence. Next week, I want to really specifically dedicate to the use of some specific government websites for evidence. Now, when I say that, I want you to keep in mind, and I'm going to talk about this a little later in the lecture, that there are all kinds of government websites at every level of government, national level, state level, local level, where you can find evidence to support your policy analysis. I just want you to keep that in mind. These are most of the time, the evidence and the data you will find on those sites is very reliable and very valid evidence. And so get in the habit of understanding what some of these sites are. They help you in this class, they help you in other classes as well. So let me get to the point of what we're talking about this week real quickly, and then I'll get into what I want to discuss this week. Okay, so just as a reminder, your policy problem statement is due February 18th. As you know, I changed that from February 11th, and the reason being is because I wanted everyone to get the benefit of discussing problem statements for one more week in week 5, and that was the week we looked at the Nebraska legislature website and looked at those legislative bills that had been proposed by various senators. And I think one of the lessons that was learned from that is that sometimes even state senators don't necessarily have a clear, unambiguous purpose in mind when they submit legislation. They may have several purposes in mind, or they may think that they're being unambiguous, but when you, a member of the public, or someone else reads that bill, you might say, well, I don't really get what it is they're trying to do. And so that's a good lesson to learn, that ambiguity is a sort of the bane of the problem statement. You don't want to be ambiguous. You want to say what you think the problem is, so that others, when they read it, understand. So let's get into what the theme for this week is. It's assembling evidence. So what I want you to note there is I don't say assembling data. The Bardeck text uses this term assembling evidence, and I borrow from that, but there's a very good reason for that. And there's 3 terms that are often used interchangeably, but they really don't necessarily mean exactly the same thing. So let's talk about those 3 terms. First of all, there's data. Well, data are observable facts, often produced from experiments, and often produced in real-world experience. They are taken from the physical and social worlds. They might be numerical, but they don't have to be. Data should be systematically collected, however. They should be validated and replicable. Often data are raw and unprocessed. The one thing they aren't are anecdotal. So that's data. What is information? Information really consists of data, but it might also consist of the interpretation of data, even unwittingly. A person may provide you information based on data, and they're even unconsciously smuggling in their own biases into the data. So that means information really occurs as humans process data. Well, so what is evidence? And this is the term that Bardeck uses. So evidence is data and information that are used for a purpose, and that is to validate or invalidate a particular argument or set of arguments. And so data, information, and evidence really can all be subjected to various methodologies and various kinds of quantitative work and qualitative work. And often, as we probably know, that the same data, information, and evidence can be used to support opposing arguments. This isn't always the case. I mean, sometimes there's data that's so convincing that it's hard to refute. But often, opponents of a policy might gather the same data that advocates of a policy gather, and they come to vastly different conclusions. So let's kind of drill down and talk about these terms for just a second. So data, it's often numeric, but it doesn't have to be numeric. What are some examples of data? Well, next week we're going to talk about the U.S. Census among other government websites. But if you go to the U.S. Census, you can see a lot of different data. The simplest one being the population of the United States, the official population of the United States and its subunits. That would be states, counties. And so when you look up that data, you will see, yes, here's the official population of the United States in 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010. So that's data. So far, you haven't done anything with that data. You just know what the numbers are. Data could also be things like statistics on the number of traffic fatalities in Nebraska during a particular year. So if during a particular year there were 287 fatalities, that's just a number. But it is reliable data that probably was published by the state that says these are how many traffic fatalities occurred in our state in this year. You might have a list of hourly wages of fast food workers in Omaha during 2016. That's data. Something we keep track of here in the School of Public Administration is all the scores of people who take the GRE test who enter our MPA program. So we have panel data. We have years of data on that for everybody that enters our graduate program. But that's just data. You could maybe look at the winning times for the Olympic men's marathon since 1896. So for all the Summer Olympic Games, you could look that up. And yes, you'd find that runners are getting faster and faster, but still, it's just data. You haven't really drawn too many conclusions from it. It doesn't have to be numbers. It could be things like the compiled results of a survey that you issued, say, to county officials across Nebraska. You issued a survey to, there's 93 counties, and you issued a survey and you got 47 results, and the results of that survey are data. But it can also be things like interviews. So you interviewed, say, 18 city managers in towns of less than 5,000 across Iowa. Well, those interviews are actually data. And a lot of people would say they're not data, but they are data. Because you gathered them in some validated, systematic way. So in research, we know that data, and you've taken research methods, you know that data is most useful when we can categorize it into variables. So variables are just things that can change or things that vary. And they come in several types, right? And then we compare variables to each other using various methodologies. So for example, if we have data on classroom size, we can compare that to standardized test scores for fourth graders in Nebraska, say, in a given year. And so far we haven't drawn any conclusions, but we can make that comparison between two kinds of variables. So your hypothetical survey you sent out, answers to question 7 of your survey, especially when you can insert other variables in there, such as the survey participants by gender, by age, by ethnicity, by level of education. And so then you're starting to compare variables. Your traffic fatality data might be useful if you can compare it with another variable, such as the number of these fatalities that occurred when the driver was found to be alcohol impaired. So now we're doing something with the data. We're using it for comparative purposes. We're using it to analyze variables in light of the situation that we're looking into. Okay, so what is information? I said information is data that's been processed somehow. And often that processing is occurring without you realizing it. So your knee hurts, it's in pain. You go to the doctor, and the doctor asks you some questions and finds out you're a runner. Well, the doctor says, look, uh, I think in most cases that your pain and your swelling will reduce if you stay off it for a week. Don't run for a week. Use ice to reduce the swelling. Take some Motrin for the pain. And this information that doctor just gave you, it's probably based on her experience as a doctor, but it's also probably based on medical studies that have occurred over many years. It's probably based on both. But the fact of the matter is, you might actually have something more seriously wrong with your knee. Um, it might not be just some swelling from the impact of running. You might have torn an ACL or something. You might have a meniscus that's bad. So that information has been processed, and that doctor is applying it to the most general case and the most likely case, right? The color red is data, right? Red is categorical or nominal data. But the color red on a traffic signal is information because it tells you to stop your car. Now, if you happen to be red, green, colorblind, you might actually mix up a red light and a green light. Or if you're red, blue colorblind, you might mix up the traffic light with a street light. So you need more information, and you have learned to process that information so that you can tell if the light's red or green. Um, Increases in minimum wage will increase or decrease or not affect the rate of unemployment among teenage workers. Kind of depends on what study you're using. And this is an example where lots of times researchers and pundits will use data in different ways. Smaller classroom sizes result in higher standardized test scores. Actually, that's sometimes true, but it also depends, and that's a classic case because there are other uh, variables that actually impact that generalized statement. So this is information. Okay, what is evidence? Well, evidence is useful information that allows decision making. And so a policy analysis, like we're doing, is really we're simulating the ability of policymakers to make a decision. Um, so what are some examples of evidence? Well, the intelligence assessments that get talked about a lot, the kinds of things that the CIA and the FBI testify to Congress about or provide the president. Um, these are not necessarily 100% provable assessments. They are assessments based on evidence and the various kinds of evidence that intelligence agencies use, such as uh, imagery from satellites and aircraft, such as human intelligence, people inside a country, such as signal intelligence, things intercepted from phone calls and emails, things like that. So they're compiling evidence. There's a big kerfuffle right now in Douglas County, Nebraska. For those of you who live here, you know that the Douglas County assessor has been criticized for the assessment placed on homes within this last assessment cycle. But that's actually, home assessments are pretty much based on valuation, commercial valuation, how much I can sell a house for. So that's a form of evidence. Um, you know, that's how home values are derived most of the time. So that's evidence. We use evidence in a court of law, and that's the very most common usage of this term, right? There's two standards, though, even of evidence in law in the United States. There's criminal law, where a jury has to find beyond a reasonable doubt that a crime was committed. And what's supposed to happen in a criminal case is the state or the prosecution is supposed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this person committed the crime. Um, and beyond a reasonable doubt means that a reasonable person doesn't doubt that the evidence the state submitted uh, is is proof of a crime? Well, the defense attorney's job obviously is to cast doubt on the evidence that the state provides so that there is a reasonable doubt. And sometimes present evidence that, in fact, this person could not have been at the scene of the crime as the state contends. But it's different in a civil case. It's called preponderance of evidence. And I'm actually being real careful here because I know we have at least a couple of attorneys in the class. So I don't, and maybe you guys can correct me, but preponderance of evidence is a weighting thing in a civil case. So basically, if the plaintiff has to try to prove that the defendant probably did the thing that they're being sued for, probably defrauded the plaintiff. But it doesn't have to be beyond a reasonable doubt. It's just a preponderance or a weighted standard of evidence. And so policy debates in legislatures also rely on various kinds of evidence. And this is where it gets really interesting for us as people who are interested in how public policy is made. I mean, sometimes legislatures, if we're talking about the Congress or we're talking about the Nebraska unicameral, they do rely on things like data-based scientific research. They may be provided with very scientific studies that they have to weed through and understand what that study is saying. Sometimes some studies are from government sources. I had you read, for example, that Congressional Budget Office report on Social Security. That's very typical. That at the federal level, the U.S. Congress, and even state levels, there are research offices that are providing unbiased research to the legislators. But they could also rely on things like the views of public administrators who have to implement various programs. So, if there's concealed carry changes for gun laws being considered in the state, they may ask police departments, police chiefs from the state to come in and testify, giving expert testimony on their views of the changes in that law. Just this week in the Nebraska unicameral, there was a debate on the governor's tax reform proposals, and there were university researchers who presented research findings before the legislature, and actually on both sides of that argument. They may rely on assessments of individuals or groups of clients who are affected by the policy. So, for example, if the legislature is proposing changes to Social Security, they may perhaps have individuals come in and talk about it. They may look at evidence like the budgets over a number of years. So there are various categories of evidence, and there's some theoretical work that talks about how much weight particular legislators apply to these different kinds of evidence. And the point is that they don't always provide, or they don't always apply the same weighting to different kinds of evidence. And since each one of them is an individual, they all have different rules of thumb that they use, maybe even unconsciously, to weight different kinds of evidence. So that's data, information, and evidence. So the point of all these is that in all three cases, there has to be some things in common. And this will apply to your project. There has to be validity. I mean, is the data or the information real and not faked? For example, a wild example, you can go on YouTube and you can find all kinds of kind of interesting conspiracy theories, if you want to call them that. The world has been controlled by the Illuminati since the Middle Ages. Michelle Obama is really a man named Michael. I mean, these are real things that are on YouTube. But is that valid? Is it? I mean, what do you think of that? I mean, is it credible? Which is my last point. So, even in the kinds of evidence that you use, think about validity. Think about, is it systematically gathered? Does it come from a large enough sample? If you're using, say, survey data, that bias is mitigated or it's discussed how it was gathered anyway. I can walk across campus. This actually happens when you walk across campus. A student will stop you and say, "Hey, I'm taking a survey," um, and ask you 3 questions. What do you think about this? I mean, this has happened to me numerous times. Well, I mean, sometimes they ask me information about my age, my what I, what my affiliation here at the university is, but lots of times they don't. So basically, they just stop several people and ask their opinion. Well, is that systematic? I would say no. Was your survey sent to a sample of the population or just to your friends? Do you go on Twitter and look at the tweets of a bunch of people after something controversial happens and say, 70% of the people think this? I mean, a very famous example is, news sites. Should we, you know, should we build a wall on our southern border? Yes or no? Well, that's not really a scientific survey. It's just something on the internet, and there's a lot of bias to it because it probably has to do with where you saw the survey being published, and it has to do with people who are actually reading the news. So is it credible? I mean, is the source of the data a source that you would consider reliable? So, we're talking about partisan think tanks, and actually, they're not completely unreliable because they do use facts and data. But I would just caution, if you're using a partisan think tank, look at another partisan think tank on the same subject, and that was the purpose of that Social Security exercise last week. And finally, can you compare this evidence that you're seeing to other evidence? Or is it so off the wall that it doesn't even seem like evidence? So some of that you have to be the judge of. So that brings us to this week's reading. And I said the readings are kind of brief. In the BARDAC reading, pages 93 through 110 are applicable. But you will notice as you read, I want you to read those. Those are tips really for a person who is involved in policy analysis and probably already working in government, working for example, for a state legislator. Assuming that you're a person who's already in what I would call the policy network. And so I want you to read that, but for this policy brief project, it might not necessarily be applicable, but I do want you to read it. And in the craft reading, you notice also that reading covers more than evidence assembling, but the last part of the reading is evidence because it talks about what government does, and you can kind of connect assembling your evidence to what kind of policy you're going to come up with in terms of alternatives. So read that as well. And then finally, I have you look at 2 studies from the UNO Center for Public Affairs Research, or CPARS. CPARS is a great source. You notice I provide the link there. I would like you to go to that link, and I would like you to navigate through that website and look at some of the research that we're doing actually right here at UNO in CPARS. And a lot of that research, I will tell you, ends up in the hands of Nebraska legislators, as well as the governor and other people. So I just give you a couple of examples. There are many, many more. And what we're going to do this week is look at the way that the 2 authors I picked assemble evidence to support their findings. Okay, so let's talk about assembling evidence from our 2 authors. This is what Kraft has to say. He talks a little bit about print media sources that are typically searchable. That's a very good source of evidence, actually. And it's a good source of evidence because it kind of directs you to what is a particularly hot topic, for example. So, you might actually, if you were doing policy analysis on immigration, you could actually go back in, say, the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, other newspapers. Those are 3 that are really easy to access in the library, and you could see what was being talked about in terms of immigration reform during the Reagan years. You could see what was being talked about in terms of immigration reform during George W. Bush's administration. You could see what was being talked about in terms of immigration reform during President Obama's administration. So that's a really good use of print media to really get some context in what you're talking about. You can subscribe to other newspapers as well, and I will tell you sometimes you have to pay. So if you want to do archives for the Omaha World Herald, you can contact the World Herald. They're going to want you to pay a subscription fee to look at their archives, but that would be a good source to look at for, Omaha politics, for example. So there are various almanacs that are published, right? It's not just the World Almanac. There are all kinds of almanacs of education, almanacs of law enforcement that provide you data. That's what almanacs do. Almanacs provide just a whole ream of tables and data to researchers. So that's a really good source of evidence. Then, of course, there's the academic journals. The academic journals, and I listed 4 there, and I also give you a link there. That link actually provides some of the most used public administration journals. And I list about 4 there. But so what you're going to find in the academic journals is a lot of policy analysis. And you're going to find some very rigorous methodologies in the journals. Now, I will tell you, it's my opinion, not a lot of people in various legislatures use academic journals. One of the reasons is often the methodology is difficult to understand. But typically, as I said before, a lot of university professors do testify before legislatures, and they're providing their research in a boiled down way. So the academic literature is good, and it's really good actually for particular topics to see what the literature says about it. Federal government websites. We're going to talk way more about this week, but there are also, or this next week, there's also state government websites. So last week I had you look at the Nebraska legislature site. And I had you look at bills that were submitted. But I will tell you, you can go on that very same website. You can find a link to the Legislative Research Office, the Legislative Fiscal Office, the Legislative Audit Office. And you're going to find data there. So the Legislative Fiscal Office is going to have all kinds of reports about the Nebraska state budget that could be very useful to you. So this is typical of any state. There are like offices in any state. Local government websites are often very helpful. And I will tell you, I'll be the first to tell you that city governments vary tremendously in the quality of their websites and what's available. But often, if you want to understand things about the city budget, for example, you're going to find it on that website. And you can go back and compare budget year to budget year. Think tanks and partisan advocacy organizations. We have a whole collection on the Blackboard side. I have a tab that's dedicated to that. And then finally, things like interviews with policy actors. Interviews are a very valid way of assembling evidence, as we'll talk about in a second. So here's what Bardek has to say about assembling evidence. He says, first, start early. And so that applies to us too. I'll talk about that in a second. So think about the value of various kinds of evidence, to your effort. Do you want to do a bunch of documentary evidence? Do you want to do a bunch of interviews? What's the value of gathering different kinds of evidence to the particular effort? You might want to start with the literature review. And that could be the academic journals. It could also be things like the trade journals. If you're talking about a law enforcement issue, there are law enforcement trade journals. If you're talking about an education issue, there are education trade journals. Same with healthcare. Same with social work. Same with foster care. So there are all kinds of trade journals that are very helpful. And the way those are helpful is they tell you what's current and what's being debated. Understand what you already know. Bardek advises you on that and gives you some examples. And then He also advises you to start making memos and actually taking notes on what you already know. Let me kind of try to make this a little more specific for our project. So, practical steps for assembling evidence. You want to start with what you know and make a memo to yourself. What do you know about this topic? You want to think about the value of sources, as he said. Is it relevant? Does it provide good background information? Is it credible? You want to understand there are different kinds of sources, and he boils them down to documents and people, right? And he says documents can lead to further documents, and they definitely do that, especially when you see what's referenced in the document. But people lead to documents. Documents might lead to people. People might lead to other people. So one source leads to another. And this sounds a lot like some kind of police detective show. I know that. And it really is. You are gathering evidence, right? You are gathering evidence. The last part of the Bardak text in the reading this week talks about political considerations. I talked about this earlier. I want you to read that. This may or may not apply to your evidence assembling effort for this project. I mean, it might apply to you later. But generally, I guess I would say for our purposes, when you want to interview someone and you say you're a student in the MPA program at UNO, they're probably going to be very cooperative. And if they don't want to be cooperative, they'll just tell you no. So it's not the kind of thing where you have to worry about your political connections. And that's kind of what Bardak talks about in that part of the text. So it's applicable in a sense, but for our purposes, it's not necessarily. So what is important for us to remember? One is I would repeat what Bardak said, start early. Part of developing your problem statement, which is due on the 18th, is doing a little bit of initial research and literature review. This is going to help you define the problem because you want to be as unambiguous as possible when you define the problem. The problem isn't K-12 education isn't working. That's not a problem. That doesn't really say anything. How is it not working? How would you argue that it works or doesn't work? So that's going to require you to have a little bit of research under your belt before you write that problem statement. Start using various sources. Think about this. Do you need to interview somebody who knows something about this policy? I know at least one student, I think maybe two, have already interviewed somebody to get more information. And again, identify yourself as a student in a master's degree program. And I will tell you that usually you'll get pretty good cooperation. And you're also a source of evidence. I mean, you know something about this topic, right? I don't want you to just write your opinion, but if you follow what Bardak guides you through writing a memo to yourself, you're going to be surprised at how much you know and how much that's going to help you direct yourself to other evidence. So make those notes and memos on the assembly process. So the evidence you assemble for this project, it has to be credible and valid, not anecdotal. I talked to, Joe, whose cousin is the governor, and he said this is what the governor thinks. Well, okay, that's great, but it's not really going to help you much in a policy analysis. Is the evidence you gather partisan? Actually, that's okay, but just recognize that there's partisan evidence in opposition to what you gathered. So be ready to use that opposing evidence as well. Okay, so that leads us to this week's discussion, and this is what I want to do, and it's our typical post question respond discussion. I have two reports from CPARS, one written by Dr. Bartle, one written by Dr. Bernier, and I want you to comment on these following questions, and you can see them there. So I want you to spend some time developing answers to these four questions, but the main thrust is I want you to read the reports, understand what it is they're advocating, and then decide whether you think the evidence that they assemble is adequate to the task. So that is your mission for the discussion this week. Again, next week, it's going to be a little bit different thrust with the government websites, which I hope you'll find enjoyable as well. But anyway, I'm looking forward to your discussion this week. And please, as always, there's my references. Please, as always, let me know if you have questions, as you have been doing throughout the course. Thanks very much.